Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nora Gutzman. I work as a senior advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, particularly in the area of human rights and business. And what we will talk about for around the next 10 minutes or so is the topic of project-level grievance mechanisms and how these are relevant to impact assessment, particularly social impact assessment. Before we get going with this, just for those of you who are not familiar, a little bit of context about why we are talking about the topic of project-level grievance mechanisms. So in business and human rights, it's important to be aware that in 2011, the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is now considered to be the leading framework in terms of the expectations of states, businesses, and other actors with regard to the responsibilities and duties of states and businesses with regard to business and human rights. Broadly speaking, the UN Guiding Principles rest on three interrelated pillars. The first one is the state duty to protect. So this is a recognition that the state has to take steps to ensure that businesses conduct themselves in a manner that respects human rights. The second pillar is the corporate responsibility to respect. So here there is an expectation on businesses to exercise due diligence to make sure that they respect human rights in their operations. And the third pillar is the access to remedy pillar. Now, in the access to remedy pillar, there is a role foreseen both for states, but also for businesses. So what we will talk about today is the role of businesses in the access to remedy pillar. Just to wrap up on this introduction of the UN Guiding Principles, it's important to recognize that Pillar 1 and 2, so the state duty to protect and the corporate responsibility to respect, really are seen as only being workable if the access to remedy pillar is also in place. So the access to remedy component in the UN Guiding Principles really is key, and that is also why both states and businesses are expected to play a role in terms of access to remedy for people that have been adversely impacted by business activities. But then considering what exactly is the role of businesses in access to remedy. So one of the expectations that's outlined in the UN Guiding Principles is that big business operations have a project-level grievance mechanism in place that local communities or adversely affected rights holders can access to seek remedy for those impacts. So this, of course, raises the question from a business perspective, what are the advantages of having such a project-level grievance mechanism in place, or why would you have such a mechanism in place? And a few different suggestions have been put forward. The first one is that really it should be considered as part of a holistic mode for stakeholder engagement. So it provides a communication channel, just like other mechanisms of stakeholder engagement, between communities and the company. In this way, it can also serve as an early warning system, if you like, in terms of dissatisfactions or grievances that the community might be experiencing, and a forum for then addressing those. And lastly, of course, access to remedy is a key principle and a right under the UN Declaration for Human Rights. So that is also why it's considered essential that businesses play a role in the access to remedy aspect. So then looking briefly at what do we actually mean by project-level grievance mechanism and what does this look like in practice? So the overarching comment or consideration should be that this is more than just a complaints hotline or an ad hoc community relations officer who, deals with some complaints that the community might have, that talks to them about their concerns. When we refer to a project-level grievance mechanism, we do refer to a systematized structure and resources, perhaps something like a standard operating procedure that outlines exactly how this process works. So that has to be the overall consideration. Then in terms of what exactly might happen in the grievance mechanism, you can talk about a different range of steps. And some of these are displayed on the slide. So, of course, the first thing that happens is that the grievance mechanism needs to be able to receive grievances from the community. And here, considerations of accessibility are key. So, for example, can complaints be raised at a local office, via email, via phone, directly with community liaison officers? What are the literacy, for example, abilities of local communities? Is there a need for them to be able to raise those complaints orally? All of these considerations should be key when designing the mechanism and how it can be accessed. Then the second and third steps are really internal to the company. That's where the company needs to go away, consider the grievance, see whether it's something that falls within their ambit, and then formulate a response to the complainant to outline why they will or will not take this complaint forward. Even if the company considers a particular complaint as not relevant to the operations, it's key that they respond to any grievances, including by then, for example, giving reasons why this complaint cannot be taken forward in the project level mechanism, but perhaps needs to be taken forward in another type of mechanism or in another forum. But the key point is that the business does have to send a response and let the complainant know why they will or will not be taking that particular grievance forward. And the next step then is an initial process for addressing the grievance. And again, depending on the context or the structure of the grievance mechanism, that can be a range of things. It can be mediation, it can be an investigation, it can be a different type of dialogue between those that are aggrieved and the company. Of course, it can also, for example, include local grievance mechanisms or complaints resolution structures that the community might already have in place that are incorporated into the grievance mechanism or that the grievance mechanism can draw on. And after this, if the complaint is resolved, that's great. If not, one of the other things that we like to see in a project level grievance mechanism from a rights perspective is an opportunity to appeal. So if the complainant is not satisfied with the resolution of that complaint for some reason, then can it be appealed, for example, to a different type of board or a different complaints mechanism or a different structure within the company? There has to be some room for that in the grievance mechanism. And then again, after the appeal, if the complaint can be closed out, that's a good way forward. And that needs to be recorded and communicated appropriately to those who have raised the grievance. Lastly, just on the topic of how the project level grievance mechanism might actually function, it's useful to be aware that in the UN Guiding Principles, under Principle 31, there are a number of what are called effectiveness criteria that have been outlined for these project level grievance mechanisms. And they concern things such as legitimacy, accessibility, predictability. So that's again the topic that we've just discussed in terms of complainants knowing exactly what will happen to the complaint when it's submitted. How many weeks will it be before they can expect a response? What types of responses can they expect? And what are the opportunities for appeal and then follow up and close out? It also considers factors such as equitability and rights compatibility. And what we're talking about here is looking at, can the different parties to the complaint participate in the resolution process on equal footing? So, of course, if we consider situations where you have a multinational operator, for example, with lots of resources, and you have potentially communities of rights holders that might be largely disenfranchised or be very poor and not have very many resources, be they skills, financial, or other types of resources, to enable them to participate meaningfully in the complaints resolution process, then there should be some room within the complaints mechanism to ensure that some support is afforded to those parties that do not have the resources available, so that everybody can participate on at least close to an equal footing in terms of seeking a resolution to the complaint. And lastly, of course, it's important that we look at the project level grievance mechanism in terms of continuous improvement. So there is an expectation that businesses review these mechanisms every couple of years or as is necessary to ensure that they function properly and address the complaints that are being raised in that particular context. While it's important that a project level grievance mechanism is in place, it's also important that as impact assessment practitioners or those of us working with or in projects are aware of the pros and cons of project level grievance mechanisms. Now, some of the pros of a project level mechanism are things such as that it may be easier to access for communities. It might be cheaper. It provides opportunities for a direct dialogue and complaints resolution through dialogue, for example. And also that it's physically more accessible, so that it's actually in the project area rather than, for example, communities needing to go to another town or a faraway place, for example, to raise a concern through a court system, for example. However, of course, there are also some things that a project level mechanism cannot do or that it's not very suitable for. And they are things, for example, around potentially the enforceability of outcomes, consistency in terms of how complaints are dealt with, what types of resolutions are possible, and associated with that, some type of precedent setting, if you like, which you might be able to get through, for example, a legal mechanism. So just to wrap up then with some final considerations of how is this topic of project level grievance mechanisms relevant in impact assessment practice. And there are a couple of different ways in which we consider access to remedy and project level grievance mechanisms in an impact assessment. The first one is, of course, that we would say it's very important that in the baseline assessment, there is due consideration given to what are the different types of access to remedy that these communities have access to. So, for example, do judicial mechanisms work? Is there a National Human Rights Institute that perhaps they can access, or an ombudsman, or some other type of third-party mechanism? And how effective are these actually in potentially resolving complaints? The second consideration is that in the impact assessment itself, there should be some sort of a scope, for example, through a grievance mechanism, whereby those that are involved in the impact assessment can raise any concerns that they have about the impact assessment process itself. And then lastly, you can say, well, there is also an interaction between impact assessment and a project level grievance mechanism. Now, that might depend on what stage the operations are at. So, for example, if it's an existing operation, the impact assessment might evaluate the project level grievance mechanism, say against the aid effectiveness criteria that I mentioned earlier. It might also consider information from on what types of grievances have been received and how they have been resolved to inform the impact assessment and then make recommendation measures. Or perhaps in a project context where a grievance mechanism has not been established, well then it could work the other way around, so that you use the information from the impact assessment to inform how you would structure that project level grievance mechanism, how it would be resourced, and how it would function to ensure that it adequately addresses those types of concerns that are likely to be raised in that particular project context. So they are just three suggestions that you might consider in seeing how project level grievance mechanisms are relevant to impact assessment.